to sketch out for you today basic approaches to the theory of knowledge. They all can be viewed as strategies for dealing with the argument based on the general form of an infinite regress argument, where we take the domain of objects we're considering as knowledge, beliefs, let's say, that are known, and then we look at a relationship of justification. It's common to think that knowledge requires justification, and so we can begin by constructing an argument of that kind. So let's take a look at how it would go. We start with the premise that there is knowledge. Then we proceed to the premise that knowledge requires justification. So there are some things we know, and we justify those things we know on the basis of other things. Then we have a finiteness premise. The way in which we justify beliefs doesn't go on forever. It's something that has a finite stopping point. So in the end, we must get back to things that are ultimate, that justify other things but aren't themselves justified. Now, as we've seen, that actually entails a couple of things stated in that very general way. Not only that it can't take forever in the sense that we just keep going on appealing to other things, but also that nothing justifies itself, and that there are no loops of justification. It's never the case that something's justified in terms of some other thing, it in terms of yet some other thing, that in terms of some other thing, and that back into the original thing. No matter how long that loop takes, still in the end, that appears to be circular. And so the conclusion is, well, there must be ultimate justifiers that are not themselves known. Now this is the puzzle that Plato lays out near the end of the Theaetetus. And he begins to think, I don't know what knowledge is anymore. The dialogue begins with this question, what is knowledge? And proceeds to a number of definitions. Maybe it's perception, maybe it's true belief. And now, maybe it's justified true belief with an account. Well, how does that work? If we assume there's such a thing as knowledge and that it requires an account, it requires justification, but that can't go on forever, we get the conclusion that knowledge rests on something that is not itself known. And he finds that puzzling. So, already by the end of the Theaetetus, we see the basic structure of the problem of the theory of knowledge. And we can then catalog the various approaches to the theory of knowledge in terms of responses to that argument. So here are some epistemological theories. Theories that adopt a certain strategy for looking at that argument. You might, of course, accept all the premises and accept the conclusion. But you might reject one or more of those premises. So let's take a look at how that would go. First premise is there is knowledge. There are some things that we know. Well, you could, on the other hand, deny that. You could say, here's my basic strategy, get off the bus at the very first stop. In fact, I guess you could say this is a matter of not getting on the bus at all. Nothing is known. That's a position known as skepticism. We're going to look at a variety of arguments for skepticism, but the basic strategy here in response to this dilemma is to say, well, so much the worse for knowledge. If we were to know anything, it would require justification, it couldn't go on forever, it would have to terminate in the end in things that are not themselves known. But that's absurd. How could knowledge rest on the unknown? And so there is no such thing as knowledge, nothing is known. A second strategy is to reject that second premise, to say, maybe it's wrong that knowledge requires justification. After all, you might think there are things that I know without having any justification, things on the basis of direct perception, for example, or maybe the meanings of words, or something that I know on the basis of remembering it. I remember what I ate for breakfast this morning, or actually, in my case, that I didn't eat anything for breakfast this morning. What justifies that? Well, it's just the memory, which is rather analogous to perhaps a perception. There might be other things you take as basic sources of knowledge. Justification in terms of other beliefs you have, other items of knowledge, that might be something that is only one of many potential sources of knowledge. That's a view known as externalism, and we'll talk about that extensively later. Another approach, uncommon in the theory of knowledge, but nevertheless defended by a few people, is infinitism. That is, justification can go on forever. And not just because there can be things that justify themselves or because there are loops. There are times when it really is turtles all the way down, when we really do have a justification that would go on forever. You might think in mathematics, for example, you could justify a claim about the numbers by looking at each of the numbers one on one. You might not be able to give any fully general proof, but you could say, well, works for 0, works for 1, works for 2, works for 3, and so forth. In fact, in ancient Indian mathematics, there was a style of argument that was rather like that. It went, works for 0, works for 1, works for 2. You see how it goes. And later that gets formalized into the concept of mathematical induction, where you actually explain how to get from earlier cases to the next case. But in general, you might say, well, there is a form of justification where you actually don't have the ability to formulate that general pattern, but there really would be a justification. It would just take infinitely long. In any case, that's a possibility. But then you could look at the other details. You could say, well, maybe some things do justify themselves. So just as externalism involves a kind of rejection of the second premise, and infinitism of the idea that there cannot be strict infinite descending chains of justification, you could take foundationalism as rejecting the claim that nothing justifies itself. Maybe some things do justify themselves. Maybe we can hold certain truths as self-evident. And if that's true, those are self-justifying in a way that enables us to create a foundation for knowledge. You might also think, maybe even if nothing justifies itself, there are webs of justification, there are loops of justification, and we accept those as long as the loops are large enough. That's a view known as coherentism. The coherentist says there are loops or webs of justification. Now, at first glance, you might think, but that's just circular. That can't be justification at all. But think about the function of a dictionary in a somewhat different context. Dictionaries define words, and they define words in terms of other words of the language. They don't, in the end, just say, well, I don't know, between. I can't define between. It's just basic. Instead, they give you definitions. But of course, an English dictionary gives you definitions of words of English in terms of other words of English. Now you might think if you really start examining this, you're going to eventually be led around in a circle. This is one big web of things. You can't really say some of these are simply basic and can't be defined. Well, if you think knowledge is rather like a dictionary in that respect, that our justifications go in all sorts of directions in this complicated web, and nothing can really be identified as being a foundation, then you're a coherentist. Finally, of course, you might accept that conclusion. You might say, no, the premises all look good to me. I accept that there are things that I know. I think that does require justification. I think it can't go on forever. It can't be in terms of something justifying itself. There are no loops or webs of justification. So in the end, knowledge has to rely on something other than knowledge. And the typical candidate for that is perception. And so you might say, in the end, knowledge just rests on perception. On something that is not known is not even a belief. Well, that gives us a way of understanding these various approaches to the theory of knowledge. We can accept this argument and accept the conclusion and say, yeah, knowledge in the end rests on experience. Something that is not a belief is not, therefore, even a candidate for knowledge. You might think there are complex webs or loops of justification. You might think that some things justify themselves. You might think justification really could, in principle, go on forever. You could think justification sometimes is what we rest knowledge on, but that there are many other sources of knowledge. In fact, externalists often will say perception, inference, that's the justification part. Then what? Analogy, testimony, memory. There are a variety of other potential sources that an externalist might identify. And then skepticism, the possibility that we don't know anything at all. Those are approaches to the theory of knowledge. They are the standard approaches in the philosophical literature, and not only in Western philosophy, in Indian philosophy, in Chinese philosophy, really given any approach to the question of knowledge at all. And why? Because it relates to the basic structure of the problem, a problem identified in Plato, a problem that Aristotle discusses as well. And Aristotle says, my own position is, well, that there must be things that are known basically and immediately that can function as first principles. The coherentist rejects the idea of basic knowledge altogether. And finally, the skeptic says, give it up. At the start, you don't know anything at all.